do you share your Catholic faith with a Buddhist? We've previously talked about Hinduism, and it's important to understand that Buddhism is in reality a reform movement of Hindu thinking, Hindu philosophy, Hindu theology. It all starts with Siddhartha Gautama Buddha, and we don't really know his dates. They range from him being born from 563 BC as late as 480 BC. But he is the prototype. He is the standard for all Buddhists. They all see him as the exemplar. He was a prince. He lived a life of wealth. He was protected by his parents and his father. And then one day he was exposed to great suffering. He realized that the life that he experienced did not parallel the lives of the rest of humanity. And he realized that the cause of all suffering in life was really desire, unquenched desire. And so he began to live an ascetic life, a life of fasting, a life of withdrawal. And he had followers, and they began to see him as the first human, and in later schools, perhaps even something greater than human, but the first one to enter into a state of enlightenment. And that's what Buddha means. It means enlightened one. So we're going to look at the four noble truths of Buddhism. This is sort of a brief creed of Buddhism, and it'll help us to see what they're all about. The first of the four noble truths is the truth of dukkha. Dukkha is suffering. It's passion. We as Catholics, we've talked about in previous NSTI lessons, the reality of the 11 passions as taught by St. Thomas Aquinas. And the difference here is Christians, Catholics, don't reject the passions. We don't reject our desires, our emotions. Instead, we seek to govern them through our intellect. So Thomas Aquinas would say we are not Stoics. We are not trying to deny our passions, to deny our emotions. We do realize that sin has stirred up our emotions in a really messed up way, but through grace and through the intellect and through our will and through the sacraments and through fasting and penances and all that, we begin to control our desires, control our emotions, control our passions. And the more we do this, we become what the Catholic Church calls saints. So we're all called to be great saints. And so we live a life of grace to overcome these passions, what the Buddhists would call dukkha. So that's the first truth, and that's kind of the Christian response to that. The second is the truth of the origin of dukkha, or suffering. Number 3 is the truth of the cessation of dukkha. And by the way, the origin and the cessation here isn't talking about like something that happened a long time ago or something that happened to get rid of it in like a redemptive event like Jesus. It's talking about in your own soul. Where does suffering and desire come from within you? And then how do you make it cease? That's what they mean here. And then the fourth truth is the truth of the path leading to the cessation of dukkha. And this is the Buddhist religion. It is a path leading you to let go of all of your desires and all of your suffering. Now, when you finally achieve this, you reach the state of nirvana, or nibbana, sometimes translated. And nirvana literally means blowing out, as in blowing out a candle. So picture a candle, you blow it out, the fire is extinguished. Now, this image has a parallel in Christianity. You'll read in the New Testament about putting out the fires of the flesh, the fires of lust. So sometimes we'll think of the excitement of our passions as a fire. And in fact, Thomas Aquinas refers to concupiscence, which is the disordered state of our passions, as the tinder of sin, or the fomes in Latin, the tinder of sin. And if you ever made a fire out in the wild, you can't just grab a log and hold a match under it. It doesn't work. First, you get dried grass or pine needles, and then small strips of bark, and then maybe little bitty dry twigs, and then thicker branches, and you get all of that started with the fire. And then once that's going, you start putting logs on it, and you have a nice fire. Thomas Aquinas and the ancient church saw it in the same way, that you take little bitty tinder, grass, bark, and you put heat to that, and that lights, and then it can make a great fire. Thomas says that kindling there, the tinder, is concupiscence. We all have it, except for our Lord and the Blessed Mother, because of original sin. And even when you're baptized, that concupiscence, that tinder, is still there within you. You feel it every day. And so as Christians, we don't want to hold a flame to it, because if we do, it starts on fire. And then pretty soon you've lit logs on fire, or maybe an entire forest on fire. That's like mortal sins and just really destructive behavior. So again, there is this idea that we want to blow out the fire, nirvana. But what Buddha's saying, what the Buddhists are teaching here is all desires, all fires are bad. In other words, they are against the passions, against the desires, even of your heart. You need to get rid of all desires. So a good comparison here would be that Thomas Aquinas says, it's okay to have some fire. You need to cook food and stay warm and heat your house, right? That's okay. You don't want to let it get out of control. So it's okay to have emotions. It's okay to have desires. It's okay to have goals and to want to do things and to achieve things. And even to have, sometimes a negative feeling when they don't happen. That's okay. That's the Christian life. What we don't want is that fire to get out of the fire ring and to get completely crazy and burn down a whole forest. But the Buddhist says, no, just get rid of the desires. Get rid of dukkha. We need no desires. So that's the big difference going on here. Another difference that's probably even more important is the idea of suffering. Like the Hindus, the Buddhists are seeking not to find salvation by intimacy with a creator God. Buddhists are very explicit, no matter what school they're in, that there is no creator, even the Buddha. And the Buddha claimed that he himself was not God or a God. Though sometimes in more folk Buddhism, you'll see him worshipped it in that way. Really, it's more of a philosophical system that says there is no God. You shouldn't be troubled about, trying to get to heaven or anything like that. Instead, you need to spend your whole life flushing yourself, removing yourself, emptying yourself of these desires, of these passions. Because according to Buddha, these passions bring about suffering. If you really want a fancy car and you don't ever get a fancy car, that makes you bummed out and you're suffering. If you really want to be married and you're not married, that makes you bummed out, so you're suffering. And so Buddha says, well, let's just not worry about the fancy car, and let's not worry about your spouse. Let's just worry about you and get rid of all these desires and passions. And that's a very, I think, attractive model for the Western world, which has become so consumeristic and so materialistic. The Buddhist message says, yeah, I don't need all that fancy stuff. I just need to have inner peace. I need to blow out the flames of desire, and I won't suffer. Here's the problem with that. No matter how much you detach yourself from all these desires, there will still be suffering in this world. Suffering is something it's part of creation because of sin, and it relates to disease, it relates to relationships. Suffering is there. And so the answer really is not to just get rid of your desires. I want to live a life that's full of desire and full of passion and full of emotion. And when I read the scriptures and I read the New Testament and I read St. Paul and I read Thomas Aquinas, I see a life that's full of joy and passion and emotion and experience. That is the abundant life that Christians are called to, and for 2,000 years that we've been doing. But when you look at Buddhism, you realize that it's really just like Hinduism, an escape, like a moksha. The nirvana is an escape from a cycle. And Christianity is not an escape, it's pursuing a path towards a goal. And this is why for us, we venerate the crucifix. We see Jesus crucified, and we see God coming into the world of passion and desire and suffering, and he himself suffering more than all of us put together for our redemption. So suffering means salvation. Suffering is given a meaning, not by us, but by God. Whereas if you look at the Buddhists, their icon, their image, their idol is a Buddha sitting there in perfect peace, totally detached from the world, which in my opinion is unrealistic. That's not how life is. So you can always use this parallel, or actually it's not a parallel, it's a contradiction, right? It's something that's against one another, of the Buddha and the Christ. The Christ is crucified. He suffered. He died. He rose again. And we are called into his suffering and into his cross and into his death so that we can rise again. The Buddhist is trying to escape everything in this life, all emotions, all passions, and all sufferings. And I'm afraid that it doesn't work. So as you talk to a Buddhist, you can say, has this been successful? Have you found nirvana? Have you snuffed out all of those desires? Or are you still trying to find meaning and still trying to find release? The good news is Jesus came to give us release. He said, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. Come follow me, and I will give you rest. So I think these two things, focus on the idea of suffering, focus on the idea of emotions and passions, and show that these two things don't always have to be bad. They do lead to evil, but they can also be redeemed and elevated to something good. That's the message of Christianity, in particular with redemptive suffering. That is the message of Catholicism. Hope that's helpful. Thanks again for studying with us at the New St. Thomas Institute, and we'll see you in the next lesson. God bless.